Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. I just wanted to welcome everyone to our call. We'll start in just another minute or so to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get on the call. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to Jewish National Fund's second edition in the summer reading series, featuring Rabbi Joseph Telushkin and hosted by the amazing Stephen Shalowitz to discuss the 10 Commandments of Character, essential advice for living an honorable, ethical, honest life. For those of you who are new to Jewish National Fund USA, you probably know of our work planting trees and making the desert bloom, but we do so much more. We build medical facilities, housing infrastructure, parks, schools, and help people with disabilities. We also support economic development initiatives that pave the way for hundreds of thousands of Israelis to move from the crowded center of the country to the Negev and Galilee. Due to the large number of participants this evening, the format of today's Zoom program will allow for participants to see the featured speakers only, but not other participants. All participants are muted and are unable to unmute themselves to keep the line clear of background noise. However, during the program, you can submit comments or questions to the speakers through the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Stephen will be actively fielding questions throughout the interview. This program will be recorded. Now, it's my honor to turn the program over to the incredible Sarah Cohen, Director of Jewish National Fund Speakers Bureau.
Thank you, Daniel, for the warm introduction, and thank you all for joining this evening. I'm thrilled we're all together for episode 3 of JNF's inaugural summer reading series. I'm looking forward to hearing from the wise and insightful Rabbi Joseph Telushkin in a few moments. It's an honor for me to introduce Stephen Shalowitz. I've been working with him for the past few months on this program, and it has been such a pleasure. Stephen is the host of Jewish National Fund USA's Israel Cast, and for the last 8 years has produced and hosted the One Way Ticket Show podcast. A Mandarin speaker, Stephen worked for Young and Rubicam Advertising for 15 years all over China and in Singapore, where he hosted a weekend radio show before moving to work with the agency in New York. He's an exhibited photographer who travels to off the beaten path communities. He's also a JNF New York board member and on JNF's social media committee. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce you to a truly inspiring leader. He doesn't really need an introduction, but here it is. He's a prolific author who has written more than 15 books on Jewish ethics and literacy, including one recent New York Times bestseller. Also, Jewish Literacy, the most widely selling book on Judaism in the past 25 years. And he's an enthralling lecturer who has been named one of the 50 best speakers in the United States by Talk Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. Stephen and Rabbi Telushkin, thank you. I turn the program over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, and good evening to everybody, and welcome, as Sarah said, to the third of our series of book group clubs. And we're just so excited to be here with you this evening, as well as to later on in the program talk about the other books that will be featuring up and the authors that will be featuring up as well over the next couple of months. And I want to make sure that we can see Rabbi Telushkin there. Can we see Rabbi Telushkin? And are you there, Rabbi Telushkin?
I am indeed here.
Oh, right. Good evening, Rabbi. You know, I have to tell you, technology isn't always on my side because I'm looking at my cell phone here and I have my computer, my laptop here. So I just want to make sure that that I can see you, and there you are now on my screen. So good evening, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you, and it's a true honor to be able to speak with you this evening again about your book, The 10 Commandments of Character, which I absolutely devoured, and thank you so much for writing it for us. Before we dive into the book, and the reason why we wanted to have you on at this time and to feature up the book is, of course, in the run-up to the high holidays. And Elul, the month of Elul, is just on our doorstep at the end of the week. So before we talk about the book and dive into the book, I'm wondering, Rabbi, if you can just, in really broad brushstrokes, talk to us about the power of the month of Elul, what Jews around the world should be doing to prepare for the high holidays during Elul, and what our non-Jewish friends should be doing and looking out for during the month of Elul as well, is perhaps a time of reflection.
Okay, thanks very much for the warm introduction. We very much associate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the high holidays, of course, with the whole notion of repentance. There is a rabbinic teaching that repentance was created even before human beings were created. And what is the reason? Because God, of course, knows that human beings are on occasion going to sin, and there has to be a mechanism for transcending the sin. Why do I say transcending? You can't undo. It's really hard to undo a bad act. You know, maybe we've all had fantasies at some point of going in a time machine and going backwards and changing something in the past, but that's fictional. We really can't do it. So we have to find a way really that we can transcend the sin. Now, this is something unique to human beings because we don't expect animals to repent. I remember years ago, I saw a cartoon which showed like a young boy, maybe 10 years old, looking at his report card. And over his shoulder, you see his father with a big scowl on his face looking, because the report card is filled with D's and F's. And finally, the kid in the cartoon says, "What do you think it is, Dad, heredity or environment?" Because the truth is, without God, the determinants of human behavior are heredity and environment. What other determinants could there be? Judaism and many religions affirm the notion of a soul, that human beings have a soul, and therefore they are determined by more than heredity and environment. They explain why two people can be born into the same family and one come out to be the most egregious sinner, the other can turn out to be a saint. So the first thing to bear in mind about repentance is, number one, we have free will. Certain issues tempt us more than others, and we all have to know our weaknesses. It would be easy for me, for example, to get self-righteous about people who are alcoholics because on top of everything else, I actually don't like alcohol. But what are my weaknesses? None of your business. But the truth of the matter is, we all have to grapple with those weaknesses. And there's another important thing to emphasize about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Jewish tradition and the Talmud, the Mishnah, is actually very insistent on we really can atone on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for sins we've committed against God. But it doesn't win us forgiveness for sins we've committed against others. And I know we have a limited amount of time and we have a large agenda of what we want to accomplish. So if we ever meet again, we can speak far more on this whole notion of repentance and how does one change? You know, what are one's weaknesses? How many of you out there who are listening, for example, wish you had better control over your tempers? How many of you who are listening as couples wish the person you were sitting with has better control over his or her temper? You know, and how do you do it? And that's really what repentance is about, trying to really improve in these areas. I'm going to say one more thought. In the high holiday period, we have the month of Elul, and then we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. From start to finish, from Rosh Hashanah till the end of Yom Kippur, it's 10 days. And in Jewish tradition, they're called the 10 days of repentance, the 10 days of penitence. And a friend of mine, a rabbi in Los Angeles, a very dear friend, David Woznicka, has raised the point. So what does that mean? We're going to act good during those days, and then God will be very impressed and grant us a good year? He said, I think the real purpose of those 10 days of repentance is so that we can try for 10 days to be particularly good and know that we can do it. If to somebody who spoke unfairly of people a lot, never again say an unfair word, the person would give up even before he or she began because you would so demoralize them. But people can do things for a day or for 2 days or for 3 days. And simply knowing then that we can make certain changes can be very energizing.
And just before we go to the book, building on that, it's the notion that we can be reflective throughout the year in terms of remembering those 10 days and what we didn't do and how we did act during those 10 days. In other words, those 10 days can carry us throughout the rest of the year.
That is a stunningly good insight. I've made this point before. Nobody just responded the way you just did. Okay, now I'll start incorporating that idea into my speech. Thank you.
There you go. You can copyright it, Rabbi. I give you I give you rabbinic permission to do that. But in any event, but again, congratulations, the 10 Commandments of Character. I absolutely love this book. And just in the spirit of time, we want to highlight just 3 characteristics or characters, if you will. And again, I want to encourage everyone that is joining us here in the group this evening, please write in the chat if you have any questions for Rabbi Talushkin. And actually, Rabbi, just before we get started, I do want to say that we do have some people that do want to say hello to you. Saul Sturm, who said he's the uncle of one of your sons-in-law, who says hello. And then also we had a Stuart Ornstein, who says, I spent many wonderful hours with you at the Brandeis Barden Institute, Stuart Ornstein. So you have many friends that are joining you here this evening. So we're all among friends, old friends and new friends.
Thank you.
Great. Now, the first of the 10 Commandments of Character, it's actually character number 3 that you have in the book here, Rabbi, is treat all people with kindness and with the understanding that they, like you, are made in God's image. So I want you to talk about the importance of that in terms of how we should lead our daily lives.
If one, in line with what I said earlier about the 10 days of penitence, if somebody would resolve that the next 24 hours, they would relate to other people, all other people they meet, with an awareness that they are created in God's image, just like we like to think about ourselves, I submit it'll start to affect your behavior immediately. I suspect if terrorists believe that, it would have changed their behavior. If you see the sanctity of other people, it changes your behavior. And so that's, really the essence really of the kindness. And it manifests itself, by the way, even towards one's children. I know you had mentioned before we spoke, when we spoke earlier, what are some of these insights as they relate to children? And I remember I was reading a book by a man I have the highest regard for, a psychiatrist named Abraham Tversky, who's both a doctor and a psychiatrist. And Tversky was treating a patient, a man who remembered he was a bedwetter until, a much older age than normally would be the case. And he remembers how his father once berated him in front of his siblings. We can't go on a summer vacation because you'll wet your bed in a hotel or in somebody's house. He was in his 50s when he told Tversky that story, and it was clear it was still like a stake in his heart. Had the father, who was annoyed, obviously, it can be an annoying thing, but had the father realized this is not what the son wanted to do, and that he was also in the image of God, he would never have humiliated him. You never, ever can humiliate another person. If you have something to say that's embarrassing, say it to the person privately. So that's what I mean by kindness in general. One of my daughters, Naomi, was once walking with my wife, and my wife put some money in a beggar's hand. And as they walked away, Naomi was then like in the 2nd grade, said, you didn't do the mitzvah of giving charity properly. And my wife said, what do you mean? I gave the person money. She said, no, you got to look into the person's eyes and see the image of God in that person's eyes. And my wife said she then did look in the person's eyes and did see the image of God, and it transformed the experience. This is a hard thing to do every day without ever letting up. But if we resolve to try and do it, our hearts will open up. Look for that matter at the history of the Jews, what happened in terms of anti-Semitism and other cruelty. It was always rooted in the belief, taking away the image of God from Jews. When people believed in the medieval age, people cannot normally be cruel to other people unless they do first deny that they're in the image of God. Terrible words were made. Why were so many terrible words made up for Black people in America? Obviously, I'm not going to say any of the words, but we all know the words we're thinking of. Why? Because people were mistreating them. People were making them into slaves. And people who otherwise thought of themselves as being pretty decent people couldn't do that unless they dehumanized the person. That's why it's so important not to use insulting words in describing others. That's why terrible terms were made up against Jews, for example, Christ killers, and terrible terms, because it was setting the stage for not only not being kind, but for committing the worst sorts of atrocities.
And so, Rabbi, when it comes to children, we have to be very careful, is what you're saying, the words that we use with our children, in front of our children, when we speak to our children. And how then does an adult come to terms with something that happened to them in childhood, whether it was physical abuse, whether it was mental abuse, whether it was verbal abuse? What do you suggest then?
Well, different types of abuse might call forth different responses. And I once wrote an article on the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. By the way, it's an interesting fact. Of the 613 commandments, 3 of them are commandments of love. 2 are very well known. Love your neighbor as yourself, and you shall love the Lord your God. The 3rd is not love your parents. The 3rd is love the stranger who lives among you, peaceably, because he too, like you, was created in the image of God. But we're told to honor parents. I think there's an intuitive brilliance and understanding. Most of us, thank God, do love our parents, but it's not uncommon that people go through periods of tension with their parents. And sometimes people can say cruel things to their parents. Parents can say cruel things to children. And they can't, and therefore there always has to be a standard of respect. During periods when one is struggling with love and other things, there always has to be a standard of respect. Now, I don't think every bad thing a parent does to a child. I know someone who was very badly mistreated by a mother and struggled with it, because abused children often love people who often love the parent who mistreats them, because they desperately want to believe that that parent really loved them. And this person had to come to grips with the fact they really couldn't. They had to have their self-image independent of that parent, because that parent, intentionally or unintentionally, was trying to destroy their self-image. So sometimes that could be a real struggle. Sometimes we were not talking about abuse that, thankfully is not nearly as bad as that. You just have to simply come to grips with the fact that parents sometimes are trying to do as good as they can, and they were struggling with their own inner demons. But one thing parents have to do, must do, is also apologize to children. I'll sometimes be speaking to an audience and I'll say, how many of you grew up in households where your parents never apologized to you? And believe me, all those people who raise their hand, it is also very, very painful, because if we believe that all people are, then we're accountable. But if the parent will not apologize, then where's the child supposed to go? I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was once speaking in Denver. For a 2-year period, my wife, Devorah, and I were living in Boulder, Colorado. And I was speaking in Denver, and 2 of my daughters, Shira, who was then 4, and Naomi, who was 6, said they wanted to come to the speech. I suspected it was going to be over their heads, so I discouraged them. But they said, Daddy, we know you go and give speeches. We want to come. So they came to the speech. There was a big crowd, about 300 people. And I'm a very proud father. I introduced Naomi. I introduced Shira. Everybody applauds. They sit down in the front row. And about 10 minutes into the speech, I asked the audience, how many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house? Among the hands that go up in the front row were my 4-year-old and 6-year-old. Now, you can imagine how people were laughing. And it seemed very funny. It was obviously embarrassing. Finally, I said the only thing I could say, unfortunately, my wife has a bad temper. But what really was happening was the school to which the 6-year-old Naomi was going was not exactly at the standards we were hoping. So I was teaching her how to read. And my wife says that the first time I explain something to someone, I'm always very patient. And the second time, I'm also always very patient. But by the third time, I could become snappy. So I had been snapping at Naomi. At the end of the speech, I went over to her and I said, first of all, I want to apologize. If you make a mistake, you're not being bad. It's wrong for me to get angry. And if I do it again in the future, I want you to say to me, Daddy, you're not supposed to do that. And she really did start saying it, and it was very irritating. But the real point, of course, that I want to make is it makes a child who is apologized to when the parent has hurt them, it's so good for their self-image. And it so helps their relationship, ultimately, with the parent. So apologies become very important. And I want to say one word about apologies. Apologies always have to be full apologies. You can never do a half-hearted apology. Well, okay, I shouldn't have done that, but you prompted it. Can you imagine if I'd said to my daughter Naomi, I shouldn't get angry when you make a mistake like that, but you have to admit it's pretty irritating when you make the same mistake over. The apology in order to restore dignity to the other party, you have to fully, which is why we use that expression, I beg your forgiveness. Begging is a term of humiliation. Very often when you've hurt somebody, you've humiliated them. And in turn, you have to say, I beg your forgiveness, because you have to somewhat humiliate yourself.
Well, thank you for that, Rabbi. Moving on right now, one of the other of the 10 commandments is being grateful. And I love in the book how you talk about how happy people are grateful people. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
Yes, in fact, I would reverse the order of how you said it. It's how grateful people become happy people. I remember years ago, it was my friend Dennis Prager who first had mentioned this concept to me, but it really makes sense. What is the mindset of a grateful person? He said, oh, look how he helped me. He really likes me. Oh, yeah, I know. She spoke up for me in my behalf. That was such a loving thing to do. So at the very moment that you're inculcating in yourself a sense of how the other person is helpful, you also are inculcating in yourself a sense of being loved. What's the mindset of an ungrateful person? Yeah, he did that for me. It's true. Now he's going to expect I'm going to do this for, oh, yeah, she spoke up in my behalf. Now she's going to come to me for some favor. What an ungrateful person reveals about themselves is how unloved they feel. Ungrateful people live in a loveless world where people only do things for people in exchange for getting something else from them. So they live in such a dark sort of world that it sort of makes sense that they're going to be less happy, because everything becomes a maneuver to get something from somebody. So what we have to realize, there are a lot of good people in the world. We're very conscious of the fact there are a lot of bad people. That's what happens. And unfortunately, that conviction is in many ways reinforced by reading newspapers, because newspapers don't print a lot of happy stories. So they very often, print the unhappy things, and it can affect how we feel about people. So by developing a sense of gratitude, you do a lot. I'll give you 2 suggestions for people to try and incorporate into their lives. We, for years, have had a tradition in our family at the Shabbat table. We go around the table and everybody says at least one good thing that happened to them that week. And think about it. Can you imagine how long it would go on if we said everybody should say one annoying thing that happened to you this week? But say one good thing that happened to you that week. And even if you had a hard week, a lot of the things you'd say that were unhappy, a year from now, you'll have totally forgotten about. But the good things can really remain a part of us. So do that. Another suggestion I have is try and go for a few days on a complaining fast. What is a complaining fast? Judaism is very cognizant of fasts. Obviously, the most famous one is coming up, Yom Kippur. And we just finished another one called Tisha B'Av. And these are food fasts. My suggestion is people, and in the Musar movement, a movement for moral self-improvement, they used to have speaking fasts where people would go for 24 hours without speaking a word. Most Jews I know prefer food fasts. But I have a complaining fast. Somebody should go for 24 hours or 36 hours or 48 hours without complaining about anything. I knew a man who described to me an experience he had. He was lying in bed one night, getting ready to go to sleep, and he was thinking about all of his interactions with his 10-year-old daughter since he had come back from work. He came home, her room was messy, so he reprimanded her for that. At the dinner table, she had bad table manners, so he criticized that. He asked her if she had done her homework. She hadn't, so he expressed annoyance. She then did do her homework, showed it to him. There were some mistakes in it, and he was critical of that. He was lying in bed and he was thinking, if my boss treated me at work the way I'm treating my daughter, I would think he dislikes me or he thinks I'm an utter incompetent. So he resolved that for 2 days he wasn't going to complain about anything about his daughter. And it put him in touch again with all the things he loved about her. Sometimes we can get so stuck in a complaining mode that we automatically think of this, and spouses often do that about each other. They become cognizant of the weaknesses of the other, and they're always waiting for that weakness to manifest itself. So declare a complaining fast, have a Shabbat meal where you go around and talk about good things, and you'll help cultivate a feeling of gratitude.
And I'm going to add one more thing to that. And I mentioned this to you the other day when we spoke, Rabbi, that a rabbi friend of mine's mother-in-law is a psychiatrist. And she suggested to him, who suggested to me, is that before you go to sleep, say 5 things out loud that you are grateful for in that day. And it will calm you before you go to sleep. It can be something as small as there was no line at Trader Joe's today to, wow, I had the best sandwich in the world today, whatever it is. Just say 5 things out loud, but it has to be out loud in order to reap the benefits of gratitude. And I completely agree. Grateful people are happy people, and happy people are grateful people. I want to remind everybody in the group to please, if you have questions, please write them down. I'm going to get to one of them in a second, but before I do that, and before we get to actually the third of the 10 commandments of character that I want to feature up this evening, which is exercise common sense, I want to actually hone in on something that you touched on just a moment ago, which is speaking up. Because one of the things that I noticed in the book that you talk about is indeed speaking up, the importance of speaking up for people that don't have a voice or people that need a helping hand. And I'm wondering if you can just touch on that just real briefly, Rabbi.
People need support. I don't know if I have anything shockingly, new to say about that. But obviously, this was always the point that Elie Wiesel sort of devoted so much of his life to, that silence in the face of evil only helps the oppressor. Neutrality between the oppressed and the victim never is good for the victim. You have to speak up. Our model is obviously Moses. Most of us are not going to have the courage of a Moses, but they do it. Other people speak up in a quiet way, but they save lives. There's the story in the opening chapter of Shemot, of the book of Exodus, where Pharaoh decrees that all the male Jewish infants should be drowned or killed at birth. And 2 midwives, Egyptian midwives, I know there's a Jewish midrash that says that they were Moses' mother and sister, but if you read the text, I don't think it was 2 Egyptian, not Egyptians, they were Semitic tribes, these midwives, Shifra and Puah. And by the way, what's interesting is the Bible lists their name. It doesn't list Pharaoh's name. Pharaoh is just a generic term for a king. It lists the names of these heroines. And in any case, Shifra and Puah saved the babies. It says because they feared God. What does that mean? They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. In totalitarian regimes, people often acquiesce in bad acts because they fear the leader or the party more than they fear God. And they say to Pharaoh, they make up a whole story to Pharaoh why they were saving the babies. So they were willing to act on behalf to save the babies. Moses was willing to speak up. These are all role models to do. And sometimes it requires guts, but we're called upon it. And that's, one of the other traits I speak of in the 10 Commandments is to have courage, because sometimes if you have all the other traits in the world, but you have no courage, you're not going to be able to live by those traits.
Yeah. All right. We have some questions, but what I want to do is really just get to the third of the 10 commandments of character that we want to touch on this evening. And for our listeners, we have, and for all of our group members here, we have probably about 5 or 8 minutes. Rabbi Telushkin has very kindly agreed to stay on after class. So if you want to stay on till about maybe 8:40-ish or so, that's when we're going to be talking until. The last of these characters that we want to touch on this evening before we get to the questions from our wonderful group is to exercise common sense.
Yes, common sense people sometimes think is just an innate characteristic that you have or you don't have. I argue that it is a moral characteristic, that even if you have good intentions, if you don't have common sense, you're going to end up doing immoral things. And I remember when I started writing a column of ethical advice, one of the first questions that came in was from a woman who had had a child born with severe disabilities. And she went out finally after about 3 months to a social gathering, and some woman came over to her and said, "You must be a very good person, because God wouldn't send such a child to somebody who was not a very good person." She found this to be so offensive and hurtful to her. She didn't know what to say to the other woman, and it bothered her. And the other woman just said, "Oh, because you're a very," it was, and she was thinking, because I'm a very good person, this is what God will do to me. Obviously, she loved that child very, very much. But you need to have the common sense to know what you can say and what you can't say, because it can be very hurtful. That's a good example on an individual, a micro level. On a macro level, I'll take a figure who's thought of as a very great figure, and who was in many ways a great figure, but who, in my opinion, truly lacked common sense, and that was Gandhi, the great leader of India. In May of 1940, as the Nazis were trampling over Europe, it was early in the war. America was not yet in the war. France was about to surrender. England was standing alone. And how does Gandhi react? He writes a public letter to the soldiers of England, pleading with them to lay down their arms, let Hitler occupy England, but don't surrender your souls to him. Now, the two most famous people at that point in the British Empire were Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, and Gandhi, the spiritual great leader of India. Can you imagine if their positions had been reversed? Churchill inspired people to fight against the Nazis. Could you imagine if Gandhi, God forbid, had been the head of England? So here's a man with immense goodwill, a man who was capable, who had tremendous courage and bravery, who stuck up for many good values, but nonetheless, in my opinion, totally lacked common sense. Germany would have taken over the world. I can show you one thing. We would not be having this conversation, because he would have wiped out every one of the Jews, or come very, very close to it. Who knows how he would have been stopped. So common sense is important in a leader, and it's important in your one-on-one dealings with others.
Well, I'm going to go into the chat right now, and based on that, Larry says common sense is not common, and that's something that you indeed talk about in the book, and I'm sure you would agree with that. Cindy wants to know, and again, everyone, I apologize if I don't get to your questions. I apologize in advance. Cindy wants to know, how do you help or deal with someone who has a very negative attitude?
Okay, so the problem with people with negative attitudes, you have two ways you can deal with them. I generally find, wait, somebody just entered my apartment and is making some noise. Let me just go close the door. This will take only a few seconds.
And while you do that, let me just say that the book again is called The 10 Commandments of Character. And I absolutely zip through this book. I'm actually a very, very slow reader, but I zip through this book, and the whole book is really underlined, Rabbi. I should let you know, I think I need to buy a new copy of the book.
Excellent. A good idea. Wonderful.
And when I see you, I want you to autograph it for me, if you don't mind.
With the greatest of pleasure, with really great pleasure. And I love that idea you mentioned before about the psychiatrist who said, say 5 things before you go to sleep at night. I'd love to see a psychological study done whether people who do that have fewer unpleasant dreams.
Well, that's why I was bringing up to my rabbi friend, this was at the beginning of COVID, and I said, I was having the strangest dreams. And he said, you know what? He said, that's what his mother-in-law said to do so that you don't have such unusual dreams. And so far it's worked.
That's great. That's great.
Let's see if it works tonight after I said it works. And, there you go. Murphy's Law. But just to go back to the question of where was the question here? How do you deal with negative people that have negative attitudes?
Okay, so number one, if you don't have to deal with them, try and minimize it. Life's too short to stay close, I think, with people who are consistently negative, no matter how you try and change it. There's a wonderful, very, very important book by a man named Adam Grant. And now I forgot, Givers and Takers?
It's called Give and Take. And one of the group members here actually put it in the chat. Thank you, S. Miller, for that.
Thank you. Okay, good. So I happen to know Adam a bit, and he's an extraordinary person, but he has a stunning insight in that book. This is stunning, so listen carefully. In business, they do a lot of studies of people. And, obviously, businesses want to know how to make more money and other things. And they basically a number of studies differentiated three types of people, which we can all assess who they are: people who are givers, people who are takers, and people who are matchers. Who'll do for you what you do for them. And most of these studies revealed that by and large of the three categories, givers earned the least of the three, which sounds a little discouraging. But then Grant's great insight is, in a subset of categories, they discovered that there was a certain subset of givers who earned the most. And what was it turned out to be the reason? Once you hear it, it makes sense. There are givers who give to everybody, and there are givers who give to other givers and to matchers. The givers who give to other givers and to matchers end up coming out best because they established a lot of good contacts, a lot of good relationships that were helpful to each other. The givers who would also, though, give to takers were taken advantage of. Their time was wasted. Their money was often wasted. So I think in life, it's worth trying to cultivate those really who are good. Now, I recognize that this is not universally applicable advice. What if the people who are always in bad moods and who put you in bad moods are your immediate family members? There is no really good answer. You have to decide how you want to apportion your time. But it is very brilliant, the statement in Pirkei Avos, Havei mekabelet kol adam b'sever panav yafot, receive everybody with a cheerful countenance. We human beings who are moody have an obligation to try and struggle with their moodiness, because by and large, it is not, in my view, and I know I once expressed this view to a psychiatrist, a woman who's very dear to me, who got so angry at me for saying this, but it's not a victimless crime. It's very hard to grow up in a household, where somebody always seems to be in a bad mood, or you find that that there could be a room of 6 people who are perfectly happy and doing well, and one person enters in a terrible mood and they sort of infect the room with their mood. So realize that the sort of people you're around are going to affect, infect's not the right word in this case, right, they're going to affect how you do, and try. So if you see that there are people who for some reason have an inner need to always be pessimistic or put things down, just be aware it's going to affect you and not for the better.
Indeed. Rabbi, we have a question from Susan, and she wants to know, is there a time that's too late to apologize to your adult children for things that happened when they were younger? And I'm going to build on that actually by saying, is there also a time limit, not only for children, but also for friends or other family members to say, I'm sorry?
There is no time limit. Saying I am sorry always, always helps. If it affected another person's self-esteem, acknowledging that you were the one who were at fault, acknowledging a cruelty that you did, it is never, never, never too late. Even if it gets rejected, it's important for you to do it for yourself. It's important it could take guts. A lot of people before the high holidays, so what they'll end up doing is they'll say, I'm sorry if I did anything that hurt you this year. Number one, you should try and think of something specific you might have done. So you have something specific to say, because otherwise the implication almost is, I'm sorry if I did anything that, somebody who's as overly sensitive as you are was hurt by. You got to, but the process of reconciliation, I'm forgetting the name of the man who wrote it, but there was a psychiatrist in Massachusetts who wrote an important book on the whole subject of apologies. And one of the things that comes out is it's never really too late. It won't always achieve all that you wanted, but you should always make that effort.
All right. Listen, just a couple more really quick points, everybody, and then we're going to be pushing off. And this one comes in from Greta. Can you suggest an antidote to the general societal drawback of parents raising ungrateful children who act with entitlement?
It probably requires a longer comment than I would. Depends why look, obviously we're talking about children who've been spoiled in certain ways, but I don't have a good 2-line answer to that question. Children should feel that they're loved, obviously. but that they also can be criticized. The Bible records David had a son, Adoniyahu. I never know how to pronounce some of these names in English. I think it's Adonijah or something, who tried to lead a revolt against David while David was still alive. And the Bible, in a very subtle line, says his father had never admonished him and never said to him, "Why did you do that?" There are children who don't get challenged. And if they see that the parents subject themselves, the parents, to a higher standard, then the children can be called upon also to be a higher standard. That's one of the values of having a belief in a God who judges people, but who judges people with love, but also with fairness. So the parents should ask themselves, how did this come about?
Right. One more thing before we go to one final question. Bintel Brief and your daughter. I want you to share it with the group.
Okay, over 100 years ago, the Forward, which was for many years the widest circulating Yiddish newspaper in America, and to give you an idea, because this will sound shocking to people, at one time the Forward had over 200,000 papers sold a day, had a column called Bintel Brief, which was ethical, moral advice, how to adjust to life in America. And I say with the greatest of pride that right now, if you have any questions, my daughter right now, she just started in August, my daughter Shira Tolushkin is running the Bintel Brief column. So if you have any dilemmas that are pursuing you, particularly if they relate to a Jewish theme, she's trying to tie them around Jewish themes, issues of morality, issues of etiquette, look it up, go online, look up Shira Tolushkin, the Forward, you'll see her Bintel Brief column. Thank you for asking me that.
Well, and the reason why I did that, not only did I want to give Shira a shout out, but we have so many wonderful questions here, and we just don't possibly have enough time to get to all of them. So I do want to take one final one, which comes from Beth, which I think is an interesting one. When ethics and other values conflict, choose ethics. She wants to know what that means, Rabbi.
Okay, remember when America was terrorized by the Unabomber, who between like 1978, for about 20 years, was sending bombs to people? It was somebody obviously who was unfortunately very bright, because if you're evil and very bright, you can do a lot more damage usually than if you're evil and very stupid. So he was sending bombs to people, and the FBI couldn't catch him. And they finally caught him because his brother recognized from the diatribes this guy was writing, his brother recognized that it was his brother. And he's the one who gave the tip to the FBI. I think there was $1 million reward, and he made it very clear the whole $1 million he was giving away to charity. He didn't want anything. And at the time, I remember in LA, in the LA Times, there was an op-ed piece saying, nobody's ever going to trust this man, David Kaczynski, again. Somebody would turn his own brother in. And I read that article and I thought, the one person I wouldn't trust is the guy who wrote that op-ed. Because that op-ed was making it very clear that if his brother wanted to murder me, he wouldn't turn him in. So sometimes ethics can conflict with a value, a very real value, a family value. Now, obviously, I wouldn't be quick to tell somebody to turn parents in. I wouldn't tell a child who was having a fancy dinner at a restaurant with his parents, and his father comments, you know what, I'm going to take this off as a business expense. I wouldn't tell them to immediately the next day call the IRS. Parents and children have to live in a house where they can trust a certain amount of secrecy. You could say to the father, maybe you shouldn't do that. But when ethics and other values conflict, look, I'll take a famous example of it, which I could speak on at length, and we don't have the time for it. Yeah. Immanuel Kant thought it was wrong to ever lie, and he extended it to the example. He said, if you see a person fleeing and another person's fleeing after him with a knife to kill him, and he asks you where the first person ran, Kant said, it is wrong to lie. Was that really the lesson that was the most important lesson for the German people to learn? That you can never lie to a person in authority, even when a person in authority wants you to do something terrible? So that's what I'm saying. Choose ethics, and you have to think with a broader perspective. Immanuel Kant was a great genius, but he had a fixed idea in his head, which made him advocate something very immoral and very, very stupid.
And Rabbi, it goes back to this notion of common sense, of course, in using common sense.
Thank you.
One final point, though, from the chat that I do have to share, and this comes in from Lisa Leff. Thank you so much. She said, I found a copy of Rabbi Telushkin's book in the lending library at a resort in Myanmar a few years ago. Myanmar, of course, the former Burma. So how do you like that? She did not write which book, Rabbi, but you're even read in Myanmar. And I'm sure you knew that already, didn't you?
I didn't know that particular example. You concluded the evening by making me feel very happy.
But final thing, I haven't concluded it yet, because speaking of books, what's your next book?
I'm writing a book, God willing, now on the power of moral imagination. Extraordinary things happened in the 20th century in medicine, science, technology, because people used the full resources of their intellectual imagination to solve problems that had previously been thought to be insoluble. We haven't necessarily made as much progress in issues of morality. If anybody has ingenious ideas on morality and moral imagination, please send them to me. I'll just give you one example of what I'm talking about. I came across it in an article in a medical textbook on medical ethics, where a professor was speaking to a group of medical students. The professor was himself, of course, also a physician. And he was making the point, no matter how sick a person is, never deprive a patient of all hope. And one student raised his hand and firmly disagreed with the teacher. He says, we are men of science. We are obligated to be truthful. If there is no hope, we have to tell the person that. So the teacher said to him, that's a terrible attitude. I think that should disqualify you from being a doctor. I want you thrown out of the school. The kid was sitting there in shock. He said, I want you to get up right now and go to the dean and tell the dean of students, I want you expelled. And the kid didn't move. And the professor said, please leave right now and go to the dean. So he got up, he walked to the door, he opened the door, and the professor said, okay, you can sit down now. I just wanted you to experience for 1 minute what it's like to be deprived of all hope. That's moral imagination. That's offering criticism, in that instance, it's criticism, in a way that could just make somebody change. I'll just quickly give one other example. There's a Jewish tradition, of course, it's a well-known one, that at the end of a funeral, after the whole service is concluded, all the people in attendance line up facing each other, and the mourners walk in a row between them, and the people call out words of consolation. I forget where it happened, but in a synagogue in the United States a few months ago, when nobody could go to funerals, except maybe one or two members of the immediate family, a group of friends of the person who had died said, look, we're all meeting before the funeral in a parking lot at the synagogue. About 30 cars showed up, 15 cars on one side, 15 on the others. The mourner's car drove slowly between the two as people called out words of consolation to them. That's what I mean by moral imagination, finding new ways. If anybody has any, send them to me at jtelushkin@aol.com. Send me suggestions. If I end up using your suggestion and you were the first one to suggest it, I will thank you by name, God willing, in the book. I only added on and you were the first one because if 10 people send me the same suggestion, I don't want everybody to get offended. That's moral imagination.
All right. Listen, Rabbi, this has really been an honor and a pleasure. And I wish you an early Shana Tova, all the very best. And we look forward to having you back here on our virtual book club with your next book or even one of the previous books. Maybe even we'll go to Burma together and try and find that book that was in that resort reading room. How do you like that?
I love it.
All right.
You are, this was a great interview. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much. And we're going to hand it over to Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining us and for being such an engaged group this evening. And Sarah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope you all can hear me because my Zoom has decided to slowly not work. So let's.
We can't see you, Sarah, but you know what? I'm the king of technical issues. So there you go. So now you're the queen of technical issues. So go for it.
I can't hear her. Can you?
Now we can't hear you, Sarah. Can you hear us?
Oh,
there you
okay.
are. Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay.
Sure can.
Yes.
Great. Sorry, of course, I'm having problems at the very end. So thank you both for your time. The discussion tonight, it feels like it could have gone on for a very long time. We are proud to announce that the fall reading series with Stephen Jalowitz is set to begin on September 23rd at 8 p.m. with Akiva Gersh. Buy your books with Amazon Smile to support JNF today, and email will be going out with registration information. So thank you all. During this time of social distancing, Jewish National Fund USA wants to help you feel closer to Israel. If you like tonight's program, you will love our #1 podcast with Stephen Jalowitz, Israelcast, a fascinating and inspiring look on what is going on in Israel. New episodes come out every other Wednesday. Check it out at jnf.org/Israelcast, or you can find Israelcast wherever you download podcasts. Again, thank you all for joining tonight. This was recorded, and the link will be sent out to all of you tomorrow afternoon. Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take it easy. And everyone's signing off, Rabbi.
Okay. How many, if I may, are we still on air?
Yeah, we're still on air as people are dwindling down. So, but what we, so people are dwindling down. So I think we're probably supposed to get on air, but I'll reach out to you separately though, because we'd love to have you on Israelcast, the Jewish National Fund podcast. So we'd love to, but really this was absolutely fabulous. And really, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. And so appreciate it.
Oh, good. I love it. Listen, interviewing is a fine art, and thank you. You really, you enabled me to really address a lot of important issues, and we really covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We really did. Yeah. So really, thank you. And a lot of people are saying great evening. So, and thank you. So I think it's good. By the way, there was one, let me just say this, a very dear friend of our family, Sandy Starkman, said to give you a big shout out because she picked you up at the airport. They hosted you in the fall of 1997 in Highland Park. And she said, I will always pray for a person in an ambulance instead of being annoyed by the noise.
Oh, thank you.
So there you go. And she said she's going to be buying the book and giving it out as gifts to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
There you go. Anyway, well, listen, Rabbi, this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you a billion. And we'll definitely be in touch. And really, Shana Tova. And I'll be in touch via email, and we'll do a couple of interviews, both for Israelcast as well as for my own The One Way Ticket Show.
Excellent.
All right. Listen, take it easy. And also Chodesh Tov beginning when Elul starts.
Yes, very good point. Okay, where do you live?
I live probably not far from you. I'm at 72nd and West End.
Oh, and we're at 100 and we have to go. Are we still on air? I don't like generally announcing my address. Yeah,
don't announce because there's still people there that are looking. There's still 68 people that are on, but now everybody knows where I live. So, but they don't know the building. So there you go. But I'm on the Upper West Side as well.
Yeah,
so,
no, you're a mile and a half from me.
Yeah, I'm just a stone's throw away. Yeah, actually, but I belong. Funny enough, this is I belong to Park East Synagogue though. Rabbi Schneier's.
No, I know the synagogue. Yes, that's a walk.
Yeah, it's a bit of a schlep, but when I moved to New York in 2006, I moved from Singapore, and I was shopping around for synagogues, and a friend of mine said, you know, you really like Rabbi Schneier, so why don't you go there? And so I went there, and I met some amazing people, and of course he's a force of nature at 90 years old and still going strong, and so yeah. And then they asked me to be the gabbai there. So I'm there at Shabbos and the high holidays.
Do you do it do you go there during the winter on Shabbat?
Yeah, I go there. Yeah, I go there. Yeah, during the winter, the summer.
Oh, God, that's a walk.
Yeah, it's not crazy far. And then I belong to Lincoln Square. I joined Lincoln Square when, very sadly, when my mom passed away 3 years ago and I had to say Kaddish. You know, I went there because I was having to say Kaddish, and it's just in the neighborhood. So yeah, so those are the two that I belong to.
What were you doing in Singapore?
I was working for Young and Rubicam Advertising. I worked for Young and Rubicam. I was a trained sinologist, a China specialist. So I was living in China.
Are you fluent in Chinese?
Yeah, I'm a Mandarin speaker, yeah. So my undergraduate was in Chinese language and literature, and then my master's was in international relations from Johns Hopkins, focusing on economics and Asian studies. So I had to pass the proficiency exams in Chinese, et cetera. In any event, and then I went to Singapore for a Rotary Scholarship for more Chinese, and then I moved to China. I was all over China for 7 years, short time in Vietnam, and then back to Singapore. I was working for Young and Rubicam Advertising in Singapore, but I also had a radio show at the weekend as well. It was first a jazz show and then a Latin music and lifestyle show, which is a whole other story. And then I gave it up, and then I was doing for Singapore Airlines, their world music channel, their Latin channel. And then I gave it up to come back to the United States to work for Young and Rubicam. But I had always wanted to go into broadcasting, here in the US, because I was doing it in Singapore and I wanted to test my wings here. So I started my podcast here, and I've been doing my podcasts for 8+ years, the One Way Ticket Show. I explore with people, high profile people, where they go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back, past, present, future, real, imaginary, or state of mind. And then I've had many well-known people that you would know on the show. And then when JNF was doing a podcast, I said, oh, if you have any questions, I'll, be happy to give a few pointers. And then it was a question of, why don't you do the podcast? So I started doing Israelcast, which has been really a labor of love over the last 3 years.
Another one of my daughters, I have 4 children. Another one of my daughters, Naomi, spent a year in Singapore. Yes, but it was much more recently than you. On Fulbright.
Oh, which university was she on? By the way, we have people listening to us, but that's fine. We have 55 people. That's okay.
How many people did we have at our peak?
We had over 224 or 220 something people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Against the Democratic National Convention.
Exactly. So we have 55 people enjoying our conversation. What was she doing in,
Naomi was studying, she got it in screenwriting.
Oh, fantastic. Do you know which university she was at?
It was what's the main university there?
National University of Singapore.
I believe that's where she was at. They had sponsored her.
Yeah.
They felt that the Singaporeans, the people there in general were so typecast in people's minds as only being interested in the sciences and not being creative. So she was teaching a course in creative writing.
Yeah, actually, Singapore has become a hugely creative city. When I was there, certainly, they had built a new performing arts center called the Esplanade. And not only would they have foreign acts coming in, but they also have local theater companies. And there are a number of theater companies in Singapore that have set up shop there, as well as many well-known musicians in Singapore, playwrights, actors, and so on. It's a very, very vibrant city. Was she involved at all in the Jewish community?
Yes, but yes, she was.
I mean, she used to go to service. I would guess she went to services, in which case she probably knew Rabbi Ebergel, who's the rabbi in...
Yes.
Yeah, Rabbi in Simcha. They're very good friends of mine.
Wow. Now, let me ask you something else, and now I'm embarrassed. This is a reflection of my getting older. My memory is not the same.
No worries.
You'll definitely know who it is. I have a friend, we've fallen out of touch recently, but it's a warm relationship. There's a religious Jew who is one of the heads of Young and Rubicam.
Oh, David Sable.
Yeah, of course.
David, I don't know if he left. I think he either took on an emeritus role because his father was a rabbi in Riverdale. Yeah. David's still around. He's still here on the Upper West Side. And I'm friends with him on Facebook. And if you want, I'll send him a note to say hello, that you said hello.
Do me a favor, do 2 things. Send him a note saying that I said a very warm hello. Mm-hmm. His father-in-law was Yehuda Avner.
That's right. Yeah. Right.
And that reinforced the connection because I wrote about Avner in my book about the Rebbe. Avner was sort of Begin's emissary to the Rebbe, to Lubavitcher Rebbe. So please do me 2 things. Please send David a note, and please send me his email.
I will. Let me write.
I would love to do that. Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I will. It's J.
Wow.
It's
Jay,
J.
oh, no, you'll get it from Sarah. Oh, I announced.
You know what? I'll get it from Sarah because
I announced it on the show anyway. jtolushkin@aol.com. I announced for anybody who wants to send me anything about moral imagination.
Yeah, because
what I do.
here Lisa said I just sent Rabbi T the pictures. Shana Tova and Kodesh Tov, Lisa. That's the pictures from Myanmar when she found your book in a. Isn't that crazy?
It's amazing. That's the great thing about writing a book is you never know who will read it. You know where it'll end up, and that's the great advantage. It's very moving when you speak. You don't know who you're reaching by speaking, but books somehow can, have very unusual impacts.
I remember my late parents saying, I believe they were in New Zealand, and they went to a synagogue, and they found a siddur that was from Beth Hillel congregation near where I grew up in my hometown, Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago, okay, the suburb of Chicago. And so they found a siddur in New Zealand that ended up there. And, you would have to imagine that someone probably brought it and said, well, we'll donate it here to this synagogue. So, yeah, it's true. You never know who's going to read your book. And I haven't written one yet, but it's quite interesting on that score. But in any event, Rabbi, this was absolutely fabulous. Listen, we could go on all night. We still have 49 people here who are enjoying our conversation. But
so let me just say good night to you and to your 49 who are listening. I wish Shana Tova Matuka, a very good and sweet year.
Absolutely, and definitely.
All of us is an easier year than this past one.
Amen. As my late mother would say, next year we should say it was a good year.
I like that. It's a good one.
Yes, she was a wise woman.
She was.
Yes. Anyway, listen, all the very best, Rabbi, and also Chodesh Tov and Shana Tova, and take care.
Dam Lacha.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.